Millionaire adopts beggar girl, but what she reveals in the morning made him cry. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel to have access to more incredible stories like this. The desert wind howled across the sprawling ranches of Santa Fe, New Mexico, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust. Ramsey Lockridge stood on the balcony of his luxurious hacienda, his weathered hands gripping the railing as he surveyed his domain. At 62, the energy tycoon had amassed a fortune that most could only dream of. But tonight, his empire felt hollow. Inside, the sound of breaking glass shattered the eerie quiet. Ramsey turned, his steel-gray eyes narrowing as he moved swiftly through the house. In the kitchen, he found Callie, the 12-year-old girl he had impulsively adopted just 3 months ago, standing amidst a sea of broken china. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her thin frame trembling. "I was just trying to get a glass of water." Ramsey's first instinct was to reprimand her, but something in her haunted eyes made him pause. This child, with her tangled hair and too big clothes, was a far cry from the polished world he was accustomed to. "It's all right," he said, his gruff voice softening slightly. "Just don't move. You'll cut yourself." As he grabbed a broom, Ramsey's mind wandered to the day he'd first seen Callie. It had been at a charity event for Little Steps Forward, an organization that helped homeless children in the Southwest. He'd gone there to repair his tarnished image after a scandal involving unethical practices in his renewable energy companies. The last thing he'd expected was to leave with a child in tow. Callie had been standing apart from the other children, her eyes wary and watchful. Something about her isolation had struck a chord in Ramsey. Before he knew what he was doing, he'd approached the organizers about adoption. Now, as he swept up the broken shards, Ramsey wondered for the 100th time if he'd made a mistake. He knew nothing about raising a child, let alone one as traumatized as Callie. The local authorities and press had been skeptical of his motivations, and truth be told, so was he. "You can go back to bed now," Ramsey said, avoiding Callie's gaze as he dumped the broken pieces into the trash. But Callie didn't move. She stood there, her bare feet pale against the dark tile floor. "I can't sleep," she admitted quietly. "I keep having nightmares." Ramsey sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. He was out of his depth here. In the boardroom, he could command respect with a single glance, but faced with this fragile child, he felt utterly powerless. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked awkwardly, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. Callie shook her head, her long hair falling across her face like a curtain. Can I just sit up with you for a while?" Ramsey hesitated. He had early meetings, calls to make, a company to run, but looking at Callie's pleading eyes, he found himself nodding. "All right, but just for a little while." They moved to the living room, Callie curling up on one end of the leather sofa while Ramsey sat stiffly at the other. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. "Why did you take me?" Callie's question cut through the quiet like a knife. Ramsey turned to her, startled. "What do you mean? Why did you adopt me?" She clarified, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know anything about me. You don't even like kids." The accusation stung, partly because it was true. Ramsey had never seen himself as a father figure. His life had been dedicated to building his empire, with little room for personal relationships. He began, then stopped. How could he explain a decision he didn't fully understand himself? "I thought I could help you," he finally said. Callie's laugh was harsh, too bitter for someone so young. "Help me? You can't even look at me most of the time." Ramsey flinched. He wanted to deny it, but he knew she was right. He'd provided Callie with a roof over her head, clothes, food, but emotionally, he'd kept her at arm's length. "I'm trying," he said, the words coming out more defensive than he'd intended. "No, you're not," Callie shot back. "You're just pretending. This is all pretend to you, isn't it? Playing house with the poor little orphan girl to make yourself feel better." Her words hit Ramsey like a physical blow. Was that really how she saw him? Is that really what he was doing? Before he could respond, Callie stood up abruptly. "I'm going back to bed. Thanks for the talk," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Ramsay watched her go, feeling a mix of frustration and guilt. He'd thought giving Callie a home would be enough. He'd thought his wealth could solve any problem, but now, faced with the raw pain in her eyes, he realized how naive he'd been. As the night wore on, Ramsay found himself unable to sleep. He paced the length of his study, Callie's words echoing in his mind. Had he really adopted her just to make himself feel better? To improve his public image? He paused by the window, looking out at the vast expanse of desert bathed in moonlight. In the distance, he could see the lights of Santa Fe twinkling like fallen stars. Somewhere out there were the answers to Callie's past, the tragedy that had left her alone and afraid. Ramsay made a decision then. He couldn't change the past, his or Callie's, but maybe, just maybe, he could change their future. It wouldn't be easy. He'd have to open himself up in ways he never had before. He'd have to confront his own demons even as he helped Callie face hers. But as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, Ramsay felt a glimmer of hope. He didn't know how, but he was going to find a way to reach Callie, to show her that this wasn't pretend, that he truly wanted to be there for her. Little did he know, the journey ahead would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, about family, and about what really mattered in life. The desert wind picked up again, carrying with it the promise of change and the whisper of secrets yet to be revealed. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the adobe walls of Ramsay's hacienda. Inside, the air conditioning hummed, creating an artificial oasis from the desert heat. Ramsay sat at his desk, staring at the phone. He'd cancelled his meetings, pushed back calls. For the first time in decades, Ramsay Lockridge was putting business second. With a deep breath, he dialed a number he'd never thought he'd need. Dr. Elena Sandoval was renowned for her work with traumatized children. If anyone could help him reach Callie, it was her. "Mr. Lockridge," Dr. Sandoval's voice was warm but professional. "I understand you're seeking help for your daughter?" The word felt strange. Daughter. Was that what Callie was to him? "Yes," Ramsay replied, his voice gruff. "She's struggling, and I'm out of my depth here." As he explained the situation, Ramsay found himself revealing more than he'd intended. He told Dr. Sandoval about Callie's nightmares, her fear of being touched, the way she'd flinch at sudden movements. "Mr. Lockridge," Dr. Sandoval said gently when he finished, "it sounds like Callie has been through significant trauma. This isn't something that can be fixed overnight. It will take time, patience, and a lot of work from both of you." Ramsay nodded, forgetting she couldn't see him. "I understand, whatever it takes. I want to help her." They scheduled an appointment for the following week. As Ramsay hung up, he felt a mix of relief and trepidation. It was a start, but he knew the real challenge lay ahead. Leaving his study, Ramsay found Callie in the kitchen, picking at a bowl of cereal. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wary. "I've made an appointment," he said, trying to keep his voice gentle, "with a doctor who might be able to help you." Callie's spoon clattered against the bowl. "I'm not crazy," she said, her voice rising. "I don't need a shrink." "No one said you were crazy," Ramsay replied, fighting to keep his own voice calm. "But you've been through things no child should have to go through. This doctor, she might be able to help you process that." "Process?" Callie scoffed. "You think talking to some stranger is going to make everything okay? Make me forget watching my dad die, or my mum being taken away?" The words hit Ramsay like a physical blow. It was the first time Callie had mentioned her parents, the first real glimpse into the horrors she'd experienced. "Callie," he said softly, taking a step towards her, "I'm so sorry, I had no idea." But Callie was already backing away, her eyes wild with fear and anger. "Don't," she hissed. "Don't pretend you care. You don't know anything about me." Before Ramsay could respond, she was gone, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the house as she ran. Ramsay sank into a chair, his head in his hands. He'd thought he was prepared for this, but the reality of Callie's pain was overwhelming. How could he possibly help her when he could barely understand what she'd been through? The rest of the day passed in a haze of tension. Callie refused to come out of her room, and Ramsey found himself at a loss. He paced the house, alternating between wanting to break down her door and giving her space. As night fell, Ramsey found himself once again on the balcony, staring out at the desert. The vastness of it all made his problem seem both insignificant and insurmountable. A soft sound behind him made him turn. Callie stood in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the light from inside. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible, "for yelling earlier." Ramsey felt his throat tighten. "You don't have to apologize," he said. "I'm the one who should be sorry. I haven't been the support you need." Callie took a tentative step forward. "Why did you really adopt me?" she asked, echoing her question from the night before. This time, Ramsey took a moment to consider his answer. I think I saw something of myself in you," he admitted. "That loneliness, that anger. I thought I could help, but I realize now I had no idea what I was getting into." To his surprise, Callie laughed. It wasn't the bitter laugh from before, but something softer, almost genuine. "Yeah, you really didn't," she said. They stood in silence for a moment, the desert wind whispering around them. "I'll go," Callie said finally. "To the doctor, I mean. I can't promise it'll help, but I'll try." Ramsey felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you," he said. "And Callie, I meant what I said. Whatever it takes, I'm here. I know I haven't shown it well, but I want to help, really help." Callie nodded, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Without another word, she turned and went back inside, leaving Ramsey alone with his thoughts. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Ramsey threw himself into researching childhood trauma, reading everything he could get his hands on. He hired a tutor to help Callie catch up on the schooling she'd missed. He even reached out to Little Steps Forward, trying to gather more information about Callie's background. The day of the appointment dawned clear and hot. As they drove into Santa Fe, Ramsey could feel the tension radiating from Callie. She sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands clenched in her lap. "It's going to be okay," Ramsey said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Callie didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Dr. Sandoval's office was cool and calming, with soft colors and comfortable furniture. As they waited, Ramsey found himself fidgeting, more nervous than he'd been before any business deal. When Dr. Sandoval called them in, Callie hesitated. For a moment, Ramsey thought she might bolt. But then she squared her shoulders and walked into the office, leaving Ramsey to follow. The session was grueling. Dr. Sandoval gently probed into Callie's past, and with each question, Ramsey felt his heart breaking anew. The picture that emerged was one of unimaginable loss and hardship. Callie spoke of nights spent hiding in abandoned gas stations, of scrounging for food in dumpsters. She talked about the constant fear, the never knowing where the next threat would come from. And then she mentioned a name that made Ramsey's blood run cold. "San Cristobal Creek," Callie said, her voice hollow. "That's where it all started, where they came and told us we had to leave." Ramsey felt the world tilt beneath him. San Cristobal Creek, the site of one of his first major acquisitions, a mining complex he'd shut down early in his career. He'd known it had caused economic hardship in the area, but he'd never imagined. As the session ended, Ramsey felt numb. Dr. Sandoval was speaking to him, outlining a treatment plan, but her words washed over him unheard. All he could focus on was the sickening realization that he might be more connected to Callie's tragedy than he'd ever imagined. The drive home was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled up to the hacienda, Callie finally spoke. "It wasn't as bad as I thought," she said quietly. "The doctor, I mean. She listened." Ramsey nodded, unable to trust his voice. As Callie got out of the car, he called after her. "Callie, I'm proud of you. For today, for everything." She paused, looking back at him with an unreadable expression. Then, to his surprise, she gave him a small, tentative smile before disappearing into the house. Ramsay sat in the car long after she'd gone, his mind reeling. The connection to San Cristobal Creek couldn't be a coincidence, but what did it mean? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it? As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Ramsay made a decision. He couldn't change the past, but he could damn well try to make amends for it. Whatever secrets lay buried in San Cristobal Creek, he was going to uncover them. For Callie's sake, and for his own, Ramsay Lockridge was going to face the consequences of his actions, no matter where that path might lead. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Ramsay threw himself into researching the history of San Cristobal Creek with the same intensity he'd once reserved for hostile takeovers. He pored over old company records, land deeds, and newspaper articles, trying to piece together what had happened all those years ago. The more he uncovered, the heavier his heart became. The mining complex he'd shut down had been the lifeblood of the small community. When it closed, families were left without income, forced to leave homes that had been in their families for generations. Some, like Callie's family, had fallen into desperate circumstances. Ramsay's guilt was a constant companion, gnawing at him day and night. He'd known there would be consequences to his actions, but he'd always viewed them in terms of profit margins and stock prices. Now, faced with the human cost of his decisions, he felt sick. Meanwhile, Callie continued her sessions with Dr. Sandoval. Some days, she'd return from therapy quiet and withdrawn. Other days, she'd be filled with a rage that seemed to consume her, lashing out at everything and everyone around her. One particularly difficult evening, Ramsay found her in the kitchen, hurling plates against the wall. The crash of shattering porcelain echoed through the house. "Callie!" he shouted, rushing to stop her. "What are you doing?" She whirled to face him, her eyes wild with pain and anger. "Why do you care?" she screamed. "You're just like them. You destroy people's lives and then pretend to be the good guy." Ramsay froze, the accusation hitting him like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" "San Cristobal Creek," Callie spat. "Dr. Sandoval helped me remember. It was your company, wasn't it? You're the one who made us leave our home." The truth hung between them, ugly and undeniable. Ramsay felt the world tilting beneath his feet. "Callie," he began, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know. I never meant—" "Shut up!" Callie yelled, grabbing another plate. "I don't want to hear your excuses." The plate flew past Ramsay's head, smashing against the wall behind him. He didn't flinch, didn't try to stop her. He stood there, accepting each throw as the punishment he deserved. Finally, when there were no more plates left to throw, Callie collapsed to the floor, her body racked with sobs. Ramsay approached cautiously, kneeling beside her. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his own eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry." To his surprise, Callie didn't push him away. Instead, she leaned into him, her tears soaking into his shirt. Ramsay wrapped his arms around her, holding her as she cried. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, the broken pieces of their past scattered around them. When Callie's sobs finally subsided, Ramsay spoke softly. "I can't change what happened," he said, "but I promise you, Callie, I'm going to do everything in my power to make it right." Callie pulled away, wiping her eyes. "How?" she asked, her voice small and tired. "I don't know yet," Ramsay admitted, "but I'm not going to stop until I figure it out. Will you help me?" Callie looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she nodded. The next day, Ramsay called an emergency board meeting. He stood before his executives, men and women who had helped him build his empire, and told them everything. "Effective immediately," he announced. "I'm stepping down as CEO. I'm transferring the majority of my shares to a new foundation, the San Cristobal Creek Restoration Project. Its mission will be to rebuild the community we destroyed and provide support for families displaced by our actions." The room erupted in chaos. Board members shouted questions and objections, but Ramsay stood firm. He'd made his decision, and nothing would change his mind. As the weeks passed, Ramsey threw himself into the new project with the same intensity he'd once devoted to making money. He hired experts in community development, reached out to former residents of San Cristobal Creek, and began the long process of making amends. Callie was by his side through it all. To Ramsey's surprise, she took an active interest in the project, offering insights and suggestions that often proved invaluable. Her experiences, painful as they were, gave her a unique perspective on what the displaced families truly needed. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks and challenges at every turn. Many people were skeptical of Ramsey's intentions, viewing the project as nothing more than a publicity stunt. Others were angry, unwilling to forgive the man who had caused them so much pain. But slowly, painstakingly, progress was made. Houses were rebuilt, jobs were created, and a community that had been scattered to the winds began to come together again. Through it all, Ramsey and Callie's relationship deepened. The walls between them began to crumble as they worked side by side, united in their goal. Ramsey saw a strength in Callie that amazed him, a resilience that had allowed her to survive unimaginable hardships. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the hacienda watching the sun set over the desert, Callie turned to Ramsey. "Do you think we'll ever find my mom?" she asked, her voice soft. Ramsey felt his heart clench. It was a question that had been hanging between them for months, one he'd been afraid to address. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But I promise you, we won't stop looking." Callie nodded, her gaze returning to the horizon. "I used to hate you," she said after a moment. "When I first realized who you were, what you'd done, I wanted to hurt you like you'd hurt us." Ramsey tensed, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "But now," Callie continued, "I think I understand. You made a mistake. A big one. But you're trying to fix it. That's more than most people would do." Ramsey felt tears prick his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That means more to me than you know." They sat in companionable silence as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky. As the first stars began to appear, Ramsey made a silent vow. He would find Callie's mother no matter what it took. He owed her that much, and so much more. The next morning, Ramsey woke early, his mind already racing with plans. He'd made some discreet inquiries about Callie's mother in the past, but now it was time to step up his efforts. He called in favors from old contacts, hired private investigators, and even reached out to some less than reputable sources from his past. If there was any trace of Callie's mother out there, he was determined to find it. Weeks turned into months. The San Cristobal Creek project continued to grow and evolve, but Ramsey never lost sight of his personal mission. Every lead, no matter how small, was followed up on. Every rumor was investigated. Callie tried to hide it, but Ramsey could see the toll the uncertainty was taking on her. Some nights he'd find her sitting up late, poring over maps and old photographs, searching for any clue they might have missed. It was on one such night that Ramsey received the call that would change everything. "Mr. Lockridge?" The voice on the other end of the line was unfamiliar. "My name is Maria Gonzalez. I think I might have some information about Callie's mother." Ramsey's heart raced as he listened to Maria's story. She had been a nurse at a small clinic near the Mexican border, one that often treated people who couldn't go to regular hospitals for fear of deportation. "There was a woman," Maria said, her voice trembling. "She came in about a year ago, badly hurt. She was delirious, kept talking about a little girl she had to find. The name she kept saying, it was Callie." Ramsey felt his knees go weak. Could it be? After all this time? "Where is she now?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, Mr. Lockridge. She didn't make it. Her injuries were too severe." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Ramsey sank into a chair, his mind reeling. How was he going to tell Callie? As he hung up the phone, Ramsey became aware of a presence behind him. He turned to find Callie standing in the doorway, her face pale in the dim light. "It was about my mom, wasn't it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ramsay nodded, unable to find the words. Callie's face crumpled, and she let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. Ramsay moved to her, wrapping her in his arms as she broke down. They stayed like that for a long time, Callie's grief pouring out in racking sobs, while Ramsay held her, his own tears falling silently. It wasn't fair. After everything Callie had been through, to have hope dangled in front of her, only to have it snatched away again. It was cruel beyond words. As Callie's sobs began to subside, Ramsay made another silent vow. He couldn't bring her mother back, but he could make sure that Callie never felt alone again. He would be the family she needed, the support she deserved. The road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be more tears, more pain to work through. But as he held Callie close, Ramsay felt a glimmer of hope. They had come so far already. Together, they would find a way through this too. The desert wind whispered outside, carrying with it the promise of a new day. And in the quiet of the night, two broken souls began the slow, painful process of healing, bound together by a love that had been forged in the crucible of shared pain and redemption. The days following the news of Callie's mother's death were some of the darkest Ramsay had ever experienced. Callie retreated into herself, barely eating, barely speaking. She spent hours locked in her room, and when she did emerge, her eyes were red-rimmed and vacant. Ramsay felt helpless. He'd faced countless business crises, navigated treacherous corporate waters, but nothing had prepared him for the depth of grief he now witnessed in Callie. He called Dr. Sandoval, desperate for guidance. "Grief is a process, Mr. Lockridge," the doctor explained gently. "Callie needs time, and she needs to know that it's okay to feel what she's feeling. The most important thing you can do right now is simply be there for her." Being there, Ramsay discovered, was both the easiest and hardest thing he'd ever done. Easy, because there was nowhere else he wanted to be. Hard, because it meant facing his own guilt and grief head-on. One afternoon, about a week after they'd received the news, Ramsay found Callie sitting on the floor of her room, surrounded by a sea of papers and photographs. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red but clear. "I want to know everything," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse, "about San Cristobal Creek, about what happened to my family, everything." Ramsay nodded, his throat tight. "Okay," he said. "Where do you want to start?" For hours, they sat together on the floor, poring over documents and piecing together the story of Callie's past. Ramsay held nothing back, answering her questions as honestly as he could, even when the truth was painful. He told her about the economics that had driven his decision to close the mine, about the short-sighted focus on profits that had blinded him to the human cost. He shared reports detailing the impact on the community, statistics that he'd once viewed as mere numbers, but now saw as real people, real lives disrupted. Callie listened intently, her face a mask of concentration. Sometimes she'd ask questions, other times she'd sit in silence, processing what she'd learned. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, she finally spoke. "I remember the day they told us we had to leave," she said softly. "My dad was so angry. He kept saying it wasn't fair, that we'd lived there for generations. My mom, she just cried." Ramsay felt his heart breaking all over again. "I'm so sorry, Callie. If I had known—" "But you didn't know," Callie interrupted. "You didn't think about us at all, did you? We weren't real to you." The accusation stung, but Ramsay couldn't deny its truth. "No," he admitted, "you weren't, and that's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life." Callie nodded, her gaze distant. "After we left, things got bad. Dad couldn't find work. We moved around a lot, staying with relatives until they got tired of us. Then the bad men came." Ramsay tensed. This was a part of Callie's story he hadn't heard before. Bad men. Callie's voice was barely above a whisper now. "They said Dad owed them money that he'd borrowed from them to try and keep us going." One night, they came to where we were staying. Dad tried to fight them off, told Mom to run with me. There was so much shouting and then a gunshot. Tears were streaming down Callie's face now, but she continued, the words pouring out of her as if a dam had broken. Mom grabbed me and we ran. We ran for so long, but they caught up with us. They took Mom and I hid. I was too scared to do anything. I just hid and watched them take her away. Ramsey moved closer, wanting to comfort her, but unsure if his touch would be welcome. To his surprise, Callie leaned into him, her small body shaking with sobs. "It's my fault," she cried. "If I hadn't been so scared, if I'd done something—" "No," Ramsey said firmly, wrapping his arms around her. "No, Callie, you were a child. There was nothing you could have done. It wasn't your fault." They sat like that for a long time, Callie crying out years of pent-up guilt and grief while Ramsey held her, his own tears falling silently. As her sobs began to subside, Ramsey spoke softly. "Callie, I know I can never replace your parents. I know I can never undo the hurt I've caused, but I promise you, from this day forward, you will never be alone again. Whatever happens, whatever you need, I'm here." Callie pulled back slightly, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care so much?" Ramsey took a deep breath, realizing that he needed to be completely honest, not just with Callie, but with himself. Because you've changed me, Callie. You've made me see the world differently. You've made me want to be a better person. And because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, surprising them both. Ramsey hadn't planned to say it, hadn't even realized the depth of his feelings until that moment. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he knew they were true. Callie's eyes widened, a mix of emotions playing across her face. For a heart-stopping moment, Ramsey thought he'd said the wrong thing, pushed too far too fast. But then, slowly, Callie's lips curved into a small, trembling smile. I think maybe I love you too," she whispered. The admission, tentative as it was, filled Ramsey with a warmth he'd never experienced before. This, he realized, was what it meant to be a father. Not by blood, but by choice, by love. As night fell outside, Ramsey and Callie remained on the floor of her room, surrounded by the remnants of her past, but facing the future together. They talked late into the night, sharing memories, fears, and hopes. For the first time, Callie spoke about her parents without the weight of guilt crushing her. She told Ramsey about her father's laugh, her mother's cooking, the little traditions that had made up their family life. In turn, Ramsey opened up about his own past. He told Callie about growing up poor, about the drive that had pushed him to succeed at any cost. He shared his regrets, his fears, and his hopes for redemption. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ramsey realized that something fundamental had shifted. The wall between them, built of guilt and mistrust and pain, had finally crumbled. In its place was something new, something fragile, but infinitely precious. They were a family now, bound not by blood, but by a shared history of pain and a mutual desire for healing. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still wounds to heal, truths to uncover, and amends to be made. But for the first time since Callie had come into his life, Ramsey felt truly hopeful. As they finally rose, stiff and tired but somehow lighter, Ramsey made a decision. "Callie," he said, "how would you feel about a trip?" She looked at him quizzically. "A trip? Where?" "To San Cristobal Creek," he replied. "I think it's time we both faced our past head-on, and I think there are some people there who deserve to hear the truth from us directly." Callie's face was a mix of fear and determination as she nodded. "Okay," she said, "let's do it." As they began to prepare for their journey, Ramsey felt a sense of purpose he'd never known before. This trip wouldn't be easy. They would face anger, resentment, and painful memories. But it was necessary, not just for the people of San Cristobal Creek, but for Callie and for himself. It was time to close the circle, to face the consequences of his actions, and to honor the memory of Callie's parents. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The desert wind whispered outside, carrying with it the promise of change. As Ramsay watched Callie pack her small bag, he silently vowed to be the father she deserved, to protect her, guide her, and love her unconditionally. The journey to San Cristobal Creek would be the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, a chapter of healing, of growth, and of redemption. And for the first time in a long time, Ramsay Lockridge felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did he know, the greatest test of their newfound bond was yet to come. The secrets buried in San Cristobal Creek ran deeper than either of them could have imagined, and the truth they would uncover there would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew. The road to San Cristobal Creek stretched out before them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast expanse of the New Mexico desert. Ramsay gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. Beside him, Callie sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the horizon. As they drove, the landscape began to change. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills, and in the distance the silhouette of mountains began to take shape. Ramsay felt a tightness in his chest as he recognized landmarks he hadn't seen in years. "We're getting close," he said softly. Callie nodded, her face a mask of emotions. I think I remember some of this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As they crested a hill, the remains of San Cristobal Creek came into view. What had once been a bustling mining town was now a shadow of its former self. Abandoned buildings stood like ghosts along the main street, their windows dark and empty. Ramsay pulled the car to a stop in what had once been the town square. As they got out, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the empty structures. "It's so dead," Callie said, her voice catching. Ramsay nodded, a lump forming in his throat. This was his doing. This desolation, this emptiness, it was all because of his decisions. As they stood there, taking in the grim reality of what San Cristobal Creek had become, a voice called out, "Well, well, look who finally decided to show his face." Ramsay turned to see an older man approaching, his weathered face etched with lines of hardship and anger. He recognized him immediately, Joe Martinez, once the foreman of the mine. "Hello, Joe," Ramsay said, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. Joe's eyes flickered to Callie, widening slightly in recognition. "And little Callie Hernandez, never thought I'd see you back here." Callie stepped closer to Ramsay, her hand finding his. The gesture wasn't lost on Joe, whose expression darkened further. "What are you doing here, Lockridge?" Joe demanded. "Come to see the fruits of your labor?" Ramsay took a deep breath. This was why they had come, after all. To face the truth, to try to make amends. "We're here to talk, Joe," he said. "To anyone who's willing to listen. I know I can't undo what's been done, but I want to try to make things right." Joe laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Make things right? You destroyed our lives, Lockridge. You took everything from us. And now you think you can just waltz back in here and make it all better?" "No," Ramsay replied, his voice soft but firm. "I don't think I can make it all better, but I have to try. For Callie, for her parents, for everyone who suffered because of my actions." Joe's gaze shifted to Callie, his expression softening slightly. "Your parents were good people, girl. They didn't deserve what happened to them." Callie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know," she said. That's part of why we're here, to honor their memory." Something in Callie's words seemed to reach Joe. He sighed heavily, the anger in his face giving way to a bone-deep weariness. "Come on, then," he said gruffly. "If you're going to talk, you might as well do it where everyone can hear you." He led them to what had once been the town hall. Inside, a small group of people had gathered, the last remnants of San Cristobal Creek's population. Ramsay recognized many of them, though age and hardship had left their mark. As they entered, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to Ramsay and Callie, a mix of curiosity, anger, and disbelief on their faces. Ramsay stepped forward, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. "I know many of you remember me," he began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "And I know that for most of you, those memories aren't good ones. I'm here today to take responsibility for my actions, to face the consequences of the decisions I made all those years ago." He went on to explain everything: the economic pressures that had led to the mine's closure, his short-sighted focus on profits, and his failure to consider the human cost of his actions. He spoke of his regret, his shame, and his desire to make amends. As he talked, he could see the impact his words were having. Some faces remained hard, unyielding, but others began to soften, the weight of years of anger and resentment beginning to lift. When he finished, Callie stepped forward. Her voice shook as she began to speak, but grew stronger as she continued. "My name is Callie Hernandez," she said. "My parents were Marco and Elena Hernandez. We lived here in this town until the day Mr. Lockridge's company forced us to leave." She told her story, the hardships her family had faced, the tragic loss of her parents, the years she'd spent alone and afraid. But then she spoke of Ramsey, of how he had taken her in, of how he was trying to make amends. "I know it doesn't change what happened," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "I know it doesn't bring back what we lost. But he's trying. We're trying. And we want to help, if you'll let us." A heavy silence fell over the room as Callie finished speaking. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. Then, slowly, an elderly woman stood up. "I remember you," she said, her voice quavering. "You were just a little thing when all this happened. And now look at you, standing up here, brave as can be." She turned to Ramsey, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You say you want to make amends. Prove it. Don't just talk about helping. Do it." Ramsey nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. This was what he had hoped for, a chance, however small, to begin to right the wrongs of the past. Over the next few hours, they talked, really talked. People shared their stories, their anger, their pain. Ramsey listened to it all, accepting the blame that was rightfully his, offering what explanations he could without making excuses. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows of the town hall, a tentative plan began to take shape. Ramsey proposed using his resources to revitalize the town, not by reopening the mine, but by investing in sustainable industries that could bring jobs and life back to San Cristobal Creek. It wouldn't be easy. Trust had been broken, lives had been shattered, but it was a start. As they prepared to leave, Joe approached them once more. His face was still stern, but some of the anger had faded from his eyes. "This doesn't make everything okay," he said gruffly. "But it's something. Don't let us down again, Lockridge." Ramsey nodded solemnly. "I won't, Joe. I promise." As they drove away from San Cristobal Creek, the weight of the day's events settled over them. Callie was quiet, lost in thought, while Ramsey's mind raced with plans and possibilities. Suddenly, Callie spoke up. "I want to stay," she said. Ramsey looked at her in surprise. "Stay? You mean in San Cristobal Creek?" Callie nodded. I think I need to really understand where I came from, to help make things right." Ramsey felt a mix of pride and sadness wash over him. He had come to love Callie as his own daughter, and the thought of being separated from her was painful. But he also understood her need to connect with her past, to be part of the rebuilding of her hometown. "Okay," he said softly. "If that's what you want, we'll make it happen. But you know you'll always have a home with me, right?" Callie smiled, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "I know, and I'll always come back. You're my family now, too." As they continued their journey home, Ramsey reflected on how much had changed. He had started this journey seeking redemption, trying to right the wrongs of his past. What he had found instead was something far more precious: a daughter, a purpose, and a chance to truly make a difference in the world. The road ahead would not be easy. Rebuilding San Cristobal Creek would take time, effort, and patience. There would be setbacks and challenges along the way, but for the first time in years, Ramsey felt truly hopeful about the future. As they pulled up to the hacienda, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Ramsey and Callie sat in the car for a moment, watching the new day dawn. "You know," Callie said softly, "my mum used to say that every sunrise is a new beginning, a chance to start over, to do better." Ramsey nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Your mom sounds like she was a very wise woman." "She was," Callie agreed. Then, after a moment, she added, "I think she would have liked you, you know, the you that you are now." Ramsey felt tears prick his eyes. "I hope so," he said. "I really hope so." As they got out of the car and walked towards the house, Ramsey felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But he wasn't alone anymore. He had Callie, and together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The desert wind whispered around them, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings and second chances. And as they stepped into the house, ready to face the future together, Ramsey knew that whatever happened, they would be okay, because they were family now, not by blood, but by choice, by love. And in the end, that was all that really mattered.